the beating and the anger that he showed towards my daughter, I've never seen from him. I would have never sent her there.
Tonight, a mother's agony. A woman who trusted her young daughter's care to her parents is sharing the gut-wrenching moment she learned her girl was dead, allegedly beaten to death by those grandparents.
She had just turned 5. Her laughter filled rooms. Her hugs could melt the hardest of days. Her name was Jada Moore. And in the quiet suburb of Park Forest, Illinois, her story was supposed to be one of safety, love, and second chances. Her mother was doing everything she could, fighting against poverty, trying to rebuild, holding on to hope. When she sent her daughter to live with her own father, she believed she was making the right choice. Family was supposed to mean protection. Family was supposed to mean trust. But then on the morning of July 15th, a call came in. A man's voice, calm, almost distant. I was beating my little granddaughter, and now she's out of it. That man was Jada's grandfather. What happened to Jada Moore in the months before that call is something the world is still struggling to understand. A story of misplaced trust, overlooked warnings, and the crushing weight of silence. This is not just the story of a little girl's death. It's the story of every child failed by the people who should have protected them, of a system that turned away, and of a mother whose nightmare began the moment she tried to give her daughter a better life. This is the story of Jada Moore. Jada Moore was born in Georgia in 2018. From the moment she entered the world, she carried a spark that lit up every room she walked into. Her mother, Kimberly Elwoods, often described her as joyful and full of life, a little girl who smiled with her whole face and wrapped her arms tightly around those she loved. Jada didn't just play, she performed. Whether it was dressing up in her favorite princess gowns, twirling in the middle of the living room, or giggling as she watched cartoons, she had a way of making the ordinary magical. To those who knew her, Jada wasn't just a child. She was a light, bright, affectionate, playful. The kind of child who waved at strangers and left a lasting impression with the smallest of gestures. She loved music. She loved to dance. And when she laughed, it was contagious. For her mother, despite the daily struggles of life, Jada was the reason to keep going. She was her purpose, her pride, her constant reminder that even in hard times, there was something beautiful to fight for. In her 5 short years, Jada embodied the innocence and wonder of childhood. She deserved a life filled with birthday candles, bedtime stories, and scraped knees from playground adventures. She never got the chance. Kimberly Elwoods never imagined her life would take the turn it did. A single mother in Georgia, she was fighting every day to provide a better future for her daughter. The bills didn't stop. The job opportunities were limited. And like so many parents caught in the grip of financial hardship, Kimberly found herself making sacrifices. Daily, quiet sacrifices that chipped away at her, but were meant to protect her little girl. She worked multiple jobs. She skipped meals so her daughter wouldn't have to. And through it all, she tried to keep their home stable, safe, and full of love. But by early 2023, the pressure became unbearable. The cost of living had risen, work hours were inconsistent, and the fear of losing everything loomed over her like a shadow. She needed help, and when she turned to her own father, she believed she was turning to someone she could trust. "I didn't want to send her away," Kimberly later said in a tearful statement. "But I thought it would just be temporary, just long enough for me to get back on my feet." That decision, made out of love and desperation, would become the most painful of her life. In March 2023, Kimberly agreed to let her daughter go stay with her father, Clint Elwoods, and his wife, Lisa Jones, in Park Forest, Illinois. The plan was simple. Jada would live with them for a short while. Kimberly would focus on stabilizing her finances, securing a better job, and building something more permanent. Her heart was heavy, but her intentions were clear. She believed her daughter would be cared for. She was happy when she left, Kimberly recalled. She had her favorite toys. She hugged me tight. I thought she'd be safe. It's a choice no parent should have to make, choosing between staying together in instability or separating for the hope of something better. For Kimberly, it was never about giving up her child. It was about giving her daughter a chance to have a bed she didn't have to share, a full plate every night, a quiet place to sleep. But that choice would become the wound she could never heal from. Have you ever had to make a heartbreaking decision for your child's future? A moment where love meant letting go, even if it tore you apart? Tell us in the comments. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. In March of 2023, Jada left Georgia and traveled to Park Forest, Illinois, to live with her grandfather, Clint Elwoods, and his wife, Lisa Jones. For Kimberly, this move was supposed to be temporary, a brief period where Jada could experience a different environment while she worked to rebuild her life. In the early weeks, everything seemed fine. Kimberly received regular updates from her father, and Jada's video calls were filled with the same bubbly energy that had always defined her. In those calls, Jada smiled and waved at the camera, showed off her toys, and laughed about small things, just like any 5-year-old should. Kimberly reassured herself that her daughter was safe, healthy, and happy. After all, there were no signs of trouble. No bruises, no complaints. Just a mother and daughter holding onto what they had left. But what Kimberly could not see, what most parents cannot see, is that sometimes abuse doesn't begin with loud screams or visible marks. It begins subtly. It starts with small shifts in behavior, moments of silence, an uneasy look in a child's eyes. It's easy to miss when you're not physically there. Advocates who work to protect children from abuse often speak about how children learn to hide the signs of early mistreatment. They learn over time that their cries may not be heard, that their voices may not be valued, that their suffering may go unnoticed. It is a cruel truth that many children, especially those so young, become experts at masking their pain to avoid more punishment or to protect the ones they love. Kimberly never had a reason to believe anything was wrong. She had no way of knowing what Jada was enduring behind closed doors. The first few weeks seemed like everything she hoped for. Her daughter was smiling, talking, and playing. It was only when the bruises began to appear, and when Jada stopped smiling in those video calls, that the cracks in the illusion began to show. But by then it was too late. It wasn't long before the joyful moments began to fade, replaced by a pattern of fear and pain that would haunt Jada for the rest of her short life. Just a month after arriving in Illinois, Jada's life took a dark turn. The first signs of trouble were small, at least at first. The issue seemed trivial, something every parent has to navigate: potty training. Jada, like many children her age, was still learning how to control her bladder and bowels. Accidents happened. They were inevitable. But for Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones, this was more than a simple mistake. It was a reason to punish. By April 2023, Jada began to experience something no child should ever have to endure. Clint and Lisa admitted during the investigation that the abuse started about a month after she arrived. What had started with small, perhaps well-meaning corrections quickly escalated. The first punishment was a slap to her hand, a punishment that would grow more brutal with each passing day. The belt came next, then the shoes. The methods of punishment were varied, but the effect was always the same. Jada's small body bore the marks of their rage. They hit her with their hands, struck her with belts, and even used shoes as weapons. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was the beginning of a series of brutal, calculated beatings. Jada's injuries became visible: bruises, cuts, and abrasions that no child should ever have to hide. But despite the swelling marks on her little body, her abusers simply ignored them. They looked the other way. They justified the violence, convincing themselves that it was discipline, that it was necessary. By the time the beatings escalated, Jada's spirit had already begun to break. The punishment moved from light spanking to full, unforgiving beatings, as if her body was nothing more than a tool for their anger. Her cries went unheard, drowned out by the harshness of their voices. And yet Kimberly had no idea that her daughter was slipping further and further into torment, hidden behind a screen of false updates and innocent smiles. The pain, the fear, the isolation. Jada's world had changed. What had started as a temporary solution, a hopeful plan, had turned into a nightmare. And all the while, no one could hear her cries. The night of July 14th, 2023, was like any other night for Jada, or at least it should have been. But for the tiny girl trapped in the house, it would be the last night of her life. Another accident, something every child her age had to face. And yet for Jada, it would be the trigger for an unimaginable act of cruelty. In the early hours of that night, Jada had another accident in her clothing. She had no control over it. She was only 5 years old, but for Clint Elwoods, this was a reason to lash out. He became enraged, as he had many times before. His anger took over, and he reached for the black leather belt, the weapon he had used on his granddaughter so many times. In the chilling accounts from both Clint and Lisa, the brutality is laid bare. Clint began to beat Jada with the belt, striking her 10 to 12 times across her small body. Each blow landed with force, each strike a reminder of the growing cruelty she had suffered. Lisa Jones, her grandmother, was there. She saw the violence unfold, heard Jada's screams, and yet, in her own admission, she did nothing to stop it. Lisa claimed she told her husband to stop, but the truth lies in the silence that followed. She watched, knowing that her granddaughter's life was slipping away with each hit. But instead of intervening, instead of calling for help, she allowed the violence to continue. No one rushed to help Jada that night. No one sought medical attention. Not immediately. No one took action to save her. She lay there, broken, helpless, and no one stepped forward to stop the pain. At that moment, the question looms in the air. What would you have done in Lisa's place? What would you have done, knowing that a life was being shattered before your very eyes? Would you have stood up? Would you have screamed for help? Or would you have remained silent, paralyzed by fear, like so many others before? Let us know in the comments. Would you have taken a stand? Or would you have been too afraid to act? The morning of July 15th, 2023, should have brought an end to the nightmare for Jada Moore. But instead, it marked the tragic conclusion to a life that had been taken far too soon. After hours of ignoring the severity of her injuries, Clint Elwoods made a chilling decision, one that would do nothing to save his granddaughter, but merely delay the inevitable. He called 911. His words, though rushed and frantic, remain seared into the memory of all who have heard them. I was beating my little granddaughter, and now she's out of it. There was no remorse in his voice, no sense of urgency that might have been expected from someone in the midst of a medical emergency. Just a grim acknowledgement of what he had done and the death that was unfolding before him. The paramedics arrived at the scene soon after, finding Jada in a state no child should ever be in: cold, limp, and unresponsive. She had suffered too much. Her small body, battered by the abuse of weeks past, could no longer fight for itself. Every breath she had taken up until that moment had been a testament to her resilience. But it was clear now that it was too late. She was rushed to Comer Children's Hospital in Chicago, where doctors tried desperately to save her. But Jada's fragile body was beyond recovery. Just a short while after arriving, Jada was declared dead. The weight of her death didn't end with the sterile walls of the hospital. The Cook County Medical Examiner's office confirmed the worst. Jada's death had been ruled a homicide, the result of multiple blunt force injuries inflicted by her abusers. Bruises, broken skin, fractured bones. Her tiny body had endured so much. The evidence was undeniable, and the cause of death was clear. She had been beaten over and over again until she could no longer hold on. In the end, there was no justice for Jada in those final moments. The person who should have protected her, the grandfather who had promised to keep her safe, was the one who took her life. Her grandmother, too, stood by, offering no help, no intervention. It was too late, and the world would now have to carry the weight of knowing that a little girl's life had been stolen from her, and the people who were supposed to care for her were the ones who ended it. But the story of Jada Moore doesn't end here. It has become a rallying cry for justice, and those who loved her are left with only memories, and the unbearable question of why she had to suffer. In the wake of Jada Moore's tragic death, there was no longer any hiding from the horrors that had taken place within that house. The truth, as chilling as it was, came to light in the form of arrests. The very people who had been entrusted with her care were now facing the full weight of the law. Clint Elwoods, Jada's grandfather, and Lisa Jones, her grandmother, were immediately taken into custody. The charges were as severe as they could be: first-degree murder. Their initial appearances before the court would leave the public stunned and sickened by the coldness of their actions. In court, Clint Elwoods displayed a disturbing lack of emotion. He sat in silence, his face stoic and unreadable. His demeanor seemed as void of remorse as it had been in the 911 call. There was no visible sign of guilt, no recognition of the devastation he had caused. He simply sat there unmoving, as the prosecutors detailed the brutal events that had unfolded under his roof. Lisa Jones, on the other hand, was a picture of distress. She sobbed uncontrollably as the courtroom watched her. She repeatedly claimed that she never wanted Jada to die. In a tearful statement, she said that she had begged Clint to stop during the final beating. But despite her claims, the reality was far more damning. Prosecutors pointed out that Lisa had not only failed to intervene during the most brutal of assaults, but had also participated in the abuse herself. It wasn't the first time. Both Clint and Lisa admitted that the abuse had begun weeks earlier, shortly after Jada had arrived in their home. They had used physical punishment, even for the smallest of infractions, accidents that no child should ever be punished for. The physical marks on Jada's body were evidence of ongoing abuse, injuries that had been ignored or dismissed by both defendants. The courtroom echoed with the horrifying details of a pattern of violence that had escalated over time. Jada's death wasn't a singular act of violence. It was the tragic conclusion to weeks of abuse. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, showing that both Elwoods and Jones had contributed to the harm that led to Jada's tragic demise. Yet even as the truth unfolded, there was no sign of justice for Jada, only a feeling of heartbreak and anger that filled the room. The horror of what had happened to this innocent child was undeniable. But in the end, it was her memory, her brief, joyous life, that would be the driving force behind the pursuit of justice. The days following the arrest of Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones were filled with legal proceedings, and the world watched as the tragic story of Jada Moore's life and death continued to unfold in the courtroom. The bond hearings came first, an early step in the judicial process where both suspects would learn their fate. The judge's decision was swift and resolute. Both Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones were denied bond, a reflection of the gravity of their actions and the undeniable danger they posed to society. But it wasn't just the bond hearing that shocked the court. As the case moved forward, the evidence presented was harrowing, a painful reminder of the brutality that had ended Jada's short life. The autopsy photos were nothing short of disturbing. The injuries sustained by the young girl were in various stages of healing, revealing a pattern of abuse that had gone unnoticed for too long. The images of her small body, covered in bruises, marks, and scars, left no room for doubt. This wasn't a one-time act of violence. It was the culmination of weeks of torment. Prosecutors methodically laid out their case, connecting the dots of a clear pattern of abuse. Each punishment, each assault, had led to the next, until that final, fatal moment. The timeline of the abuse was painted in stark detail. Clint and Lisa had been hurting Jada long before that last night. The evidence spoke for itself. It wasn't just a case of a single act gone wrong. It was the result of systemic neglect, cruelty, and abuse over a period of time. Lisa's defense strategy, however, seemed to offer little to absolve her of guilt. Her attorneys attempted to shift the blame squarely onto Clint, portraying him as the primary aggressor. They argued that Lisa had tried to intervene, that she had begged her husband to stop when things went too far. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They reminded the court that Lisa had been complicit from the very beginning. She wasn't a helpless bystander. She had actively participated in the abuse, even inflicting harm herself. Her tears and claims of regret couldn't erase the fact that time and again, she had failed to protect Jada. The trial, still ongoing, is a haunting reminder of how easily a child's suffering can be ignored or overlooked. With each passing day, the horrific details of Jada's life with her grandparents became more and more apparent. The question that lingered in the air, however, was one of justice. How should the system respond to such a crime? Should both Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones face the same sentence? Should they both bear the weight of Jada's death equally? Or is there more to their individual culpability? As the case progresses, it is clear that Jada's story is far from over. The pursuit of justice will continue to unfold, and as more details emerge, the nation will remain captivated by the fight for accountability. The question on everyone's mind now is whether true justice can ever be served for a little girl whose life was taken in the most unimaginable way. The question echoes through the hearts of those who learned of Jada Moore's tragic death. How could this happen? How could a little girl, full of life and promise, end up in the hands of those who had hurt her so mercilessly? Jada's death is not just a case of familial betrayal. It is a glaring failure of the system meant to protect her. The shocking truth is that no one ever checked on her well-being once she was sent to Illinois. Jada's mother, Kimberly, had made the difficult decision to send her daughter to live with her own father, trusting him to provide a safe and stable environment. But what Kimberly couldn't know was that, because this arrangement was informal, there was no oversight, no official checks to ensure Jada's safety. In an ideal world, a temporary guardianship like this would have involved regular wellness visits, follow-up inspections, and thorough assessments by Child Protective Services. But none of that happened. Both Georgia and Illinois Child Protective Services failed to intervene. There was no system in place to monitor the well-being of children being transferred between family members. No routine checks to make sure they weren't being neglected or abused. Even after Jada was reported missing, there was no immediate sign that anyone had looked into the situation. By the time the system caught up, it was far too late. Advocacy groups, horrified by the failure of this system, have rallied behind the push for reform. They argue that a system that allows children to be placed in the care of unvetted relatives without proper checks is an outdated and dangerous one. These groups are now calling for immediate policy changes, demanding mandatory wellness checks for all child transfer cases. They want to ensure that no more children like Jada are left vulnerable to the whims of those who may exploit their trust. Experts in child welfare have weighed in on this devastating gap in child protection. They stress the importance of mandatory monitoring, not just at the beginning of a placement, but throughout its duration. Without such oversight, children are left at the mercy of those who may hide their abuse behind closed doors. Had there been a wellness check in place, Jada's pain might have been noticed sooner. Had someone been required to visit her home, perhaps the abuse would have been stopped before it escalated to the point of no return. As the push for policy reform continues to grow, it's clear that Jada's story is becoming a catalyst for change. Advocates, lawmakers, and child welfare experts are fighting to make sure that no more children fall through the cracks of a broken system. But even as these changes are discussed, the painful truth remains. Jada Moore's life was tragically cut short by those who should have protected her, and the failure of the system played an undeniable role in that loss. The question remains, how many more children will suffer before real reform is enacted? In the wake of Jada's death, Kimberly Elwoods, Jada's mother, was left with a grief too heavy to bear. She had trusted her father, Clint Elwoods, to care for her daughter while she worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. The weight of her decision now haunted her every waking moment. Standing at Jada's memorial in Park Forest, Kimberly shared her devastating truth with the world. I trusted my father. I never thought he would hurt her. Her voice broke as she spoke, a mother's heart shattered by the unimaginable loss of her little girl. Kimberly's interviews in the aftermath were filled with raw emotion. Through the tears, she expressed the profound regret she now carried with her. Regret for believing that sending her daughter to Illinois would be a temporary solution, a chance for Jada to have a stable home while Kimberly tried to get back on her feet. She spoke of her trauma, how the betrayal of her own flesh and blood left her questioning everything. The pain of realizing that her daughter had been subjected to abuse in the very home she thought would protect her was unbearable. As Kimberly stood at the vigil, surrounded by the warmth of the community, it was clear that this was not just a personal loss. It was a loss felt by many. The people of Park Forest gathered, their candles glowing in the night, a sea of light in memory of the bright, joyful girl they would never get to know. Teddy bears, hand-painted signs, and flowers adorned the site, each one a symbol of the love and support the community had for Jada, a love that should have been enough to protect her. In the midst of the grief, Kimberly made a desperate plea to other parents, urging them to trust their instincts and never ignore any warning signs when it came to the safety of their children. If you see something, say something. If something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I would lose my daughter like this. No one should ever have to go through this kind of pain. The memorial in Park Forest was not just a gathering of mourners. It was a powerful statement of solidarity. It was the community's way of showing Kimberly that, although the pain of losing Jada was unbearable, she was not alone. The candles burned brightly that night, a reminder that justice for Jada was not just a personal fight. It was a collective one. Through the sorrow, Kimberly vowed to keep fighting for her daughter's memory. She hoped that by sharing Jada's story, the world would be reminded of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable, children like Jada, who never got the chance to grow up, who never got the chance to dance, laugh, and dream like other children. Kimberly's voice became a beacon for change, even in the midst of her own heartache. As the vigil came to a close, the crowd stood together in silence, united in their grief and their commitment to ensure that Jada's death would not be in vain. Jada Moore's life was tragically cut short, but her spirit, her joy, and her innocence will never be forgotten. Though she was only 5 years old, Jada's legacy lives on in the hearts of those who knew her and in the countless others who have learned her story. She was a bright soul, full of love, laughter, and a promise of a future that will never come. Her death, a senseless act of cruelty, sparked an outpouring of grief and action. From the darkest of tragedies, a movement was born. Online, the hashtag Justice for Jada began to spread like wildfire. It became a symbol not just for the fight to bring justice to her killers, but for a broader cause, child protection reform. Petitions were signed, and voices united in demand for change. People across the country rallied together, advocating for stronger regulations and oversight for child welfare. The cries for justice were heard far and wide, with candlelight vigils held in cities across the nation. Each flickering candle represented not just a memory of Jada, but the collective will to ensure no other child would face the same fate. Jada's story became more than just a tragic tale. It became a rallying cry for all children whose voices have been silenced by abuse and neglect. Advocacy groups, lawmakers, and citizens alike began to question how the system could fail so catastrophically, how a child could be left in the care of a known abuser without any oversight, how something so preventable could go unnoticed for so long. But it's not just the public that needs to change. The system itself must evolve. Informal guardianship, the lack of follow-up checks, and the absence of mandatory wellness visits for children transferred between families must be reevaluated. Jada's death exposed these gaps in our system, gaps that put vulnerable children at risk. As the movement continued to grow, the call for policy reform became louder. Advocates demanded that the child protection system be reformed, that all guardianship arrangements, whether formal or informal, be subjected to stringent checks and balances. The message was clear. The system must be held accountable. And so, we turn to you, the viewers. What needs to change in our system? How can we ensure that no other child falls through the cracks? If you were in Kimberly's place, what would you have done differently? And how can we prevent this tragedy from repeating itself? Should informal guardianship be legal without proper checks and safety measures? These questions are not just for reflection. They are a call to action. Share your thoughts in the comments and let your voice be heard. This is not just Jada's story. It is a story of all children who need our protection, our vigilance, and our advocacy. As we close, let us honor Jada's memory by fighting for change. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that demand justice. Together, we can help ensure that no more lives are stolen too soon.